Hey guys, it's Convolva here, and today we're going to talk about image lines frequency shifter. This is a completely detailed video on the frequency shifter that FL Studio has just launched. So we are going to go over everything from where and what kind of problems this plugin solves to the knobs and parameters that are on this plugin. And then we're going to finish it off with some fun examples in the end. So without further ado, let's get right to it. So before we indulge ourselves with information about all the knobs and parameters that the plugin has, let's first take a look into how this plugin is different from the regular pitch shifting that is there on various places in FL Studio, such as channels, new tone, samplers and stuff like that. So whenever we try to pitch shift using knobs such as these in FL Studio, we are essentially changing the frequency in ratio. And this is done while maintaining the frequency harmonic relationship of sounds. So what does that mean?
Okay, so for instance, let's take a snare sample like this, and let's assume that I'm trying to repitch it so that it fits better in the mix. And you can see the frequency spectrum over this side. Notice what happens when I try to pitch it down with this pitch knob. It suddenly starts to sound a little weird, and even though the low frequencies have come down, the crunchiness of the snare sound is all gone. And it has become more muffled and it loses a lot of that character that came initially with the high frequencies. If you look at the spectrum, we would see that the low frequencies have come down by 100 Hz or so. However, the high frequencies closer to 20,000 Hz have traveled almost to 10,000 Hz, which is a much greater difference in comparison. So why is that? Because it seems like the high frequencies have traveled a lot more than the low frequencies. Before we get to that, let's take a look at what happens when we try the other way around and increase the pitch this time. You would notice that the high frequencies have started to clump together and create this weird high end that sounds metallic and sibilant, which is a little annoying to listen to. The crunchy character of the snare is gone now, and it has been replaced by this thin sound which almost sounds like it has been passed through a constricted passage such as a PVC pipe or something. So why is this happening?
This is because regular pitch shifting maintains frequency harmonic relationship of sounds, and that means that the pitching is happening in ratios and by multiplication. For every small increments in the low frequencies, there is a much higher increment in the higher frequencies, which is primarily done to avoid any dissonance in the music whenever you pitch melodic instruments such as piano, guitar and flutes, stuff like that, and they tend to stop sounding like the instrument whenever you use frequency shifting. But yeah, more on that later on where not to use that.
So for example, if I had to increase the pitch by 12 semitones or 1 octave, I'm essentially multiplying each frequency by a factor of 2, which means that 20 Hz becomes 40 Hz, 40 Hz becomes 80 Hz, and 10,000 Hz becomes 20,000 Hz. So you can see why the high frequencies seem to travel a lot more than the low frequencies. Now, while this is great for melodic instruments, this can kind of be an issue when pitching percussive things such as snares up and down, as we saw in the earlier example. So how do we solve this issue? Enter the frequency shifter, which only shifts by the same amount in frequency, irrespective of whether it was a high frequency or a low frequency. So let's try shifting it by this now. You would notice that now the sound retains its original crunchy texture, even though I have shifted it up by 420 Hz. And this is because all the frequencies in the spectrum are now being shifted by the same offset, which means that the low frequencies are being shifted up by 420 Hz and so are the high frequencies. So 100 Hz becomes 520 Hz and 10,000 Hz becomes 10,420 Hz. And not some multipliable factor by which the frequencies are moving. So let's talk further on that.
So you can think of frequency shifting as a sort of offset where you add a certain frequency or subtract a certain frequency, and it would be the same irrespective of what the original sound's frequency was. So if you had an offset of 100 Hz, your 20 Hz would become 120 Hz, and in case of 2000 Hz, it would become 2100 Hz. which is the same difference in both cases. Alright, if you remember some time ago I said that we shouldn't be using frequency shifting on things which have harmonic content such as pianos, guitars, flutes, or any other instrument which has some melodic characteristic to it. So let's see what happens if we do use frequency shifting for those instruments.
Let's take a guitar sound and then pass it through a frequency shifter.
So this is how it would sound if I were to only press one note.
So this is without frequency shifting. And then frequency shifted by, let's say, 100 Hz. And now with.
Sounds like something is not quite right. Let's take a look at what happens if we hold multiple notes, like a chord.
So this is without frequency shifting. And now with.
Okay, hold on. What dystopian future did we just enter into? What went wrong there? To understand that, we need to first take a look at how sounds work in the first place.
Alright, so to demonstrate, I'm going to get hammer to be my melodic instrument and then play a saw wave. The important thing to note here is that all sounds that you hear are made up of sine waves. In fact, let me rephrase. Every single waveform is made up of sine waves. And I really mean all of them. Even the ones you cannot hear, such as radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves, hand waves. Okay, not hand waves. That one was a joke. So here we have a saw wave, and just like every single waveform, it is made up of sine waves. And if you look inside a spectrum analyzer, or this thing over here, you would see these things which are called as partials or harmonics. The bottommost one is what we call as the fundamental, and the rest are its harmonic overtones. And they are all sine waves at various frequencies. And I can demonstrate that easily by putting a low pass filter on it like this, which removes all the higher frequency sine waves, leaving only one sine wave, which you can see here in the oscilloscope. And the character or timbre of the sound changes significantly as I add them back again. And so does the waveform in our oscilloscope, as you can see here. In a melodic instrument, these sine waves are what we call as harmonics. And I don't want to go too deep into this, but for the sake of the video, this is the fundamental, or also known as the first harmonic. This is the second harmonic, this is the third, and so on. The first harmonic plays a frequency that is corresponding to the note that you play, and all the other harmonics are multiples of that frequency. So what does that mean? So the second harmonic would be twice the frequency of the first harmonic, and the third would be 3x, the fourth would be 4x, and so on. So whenever we use a frequency shifter like this and offset the frequency, then the ratio relationship that was previously maintained is not there anymore. So for example, if the first harmonic was initially at 100 Hz and the rest of the harmonics were at 200, 300, 400 and so on, and if we shift the sound by 100 Hz with a frequency shifter, then our resultant sound would have a first harmonic at 200 Hz and the second harmonic becomes 300, third becomes 400 and so on. And now, as you can see, if we try to use the same ratio relationship of 2x, 3x, 4x, it no longer is maintained anymore in this. And you can clearly see that if we divide the second harmonic by 2, it no longer gives us the fundamental or the first harmonic's frequency. And it no longer follows the harmonic relationship that melodic instruments do. By the way, a quick side note, this harmonic relationship is a universal thing and it is true for any periodic oscillating system and not just something specific to only music. So it applies to any system that oscillates periodically. The things that do not follow this trend of periodic oscillations are what we call as inharmonic sounds, as even though they may be made up of sine waves just like our saw wave here, they do not have a mathematical relationship that goes like F, 2F, 3F, 4F, etc. Which is why we can hear these nasty sounds. So even though the frequency shifter doesn't do a good job with melodic instruments which follow the harmonic series, we have plenty of musical instruments which are inharmonic in nature and have inharmonic overtones in them, such as these. And you've guessed it, this works best with percussive sounds which don't have melodic content in them, such as hats, cymbals, snares, tabla.
Alright, let's now take a deeper look into the controls that this plugin has to offer.
So when we open up Frequency Shifter, we are greeted with this interface, and this big knob right here is the frequency control of the plugin, which allows for frequency shifting in Hertz when we select either one of the first two modes. The frequency knob also doubles down as a rate control whenever we are in the ring modulation mode, but more on that later in the video. This brings us to the mode switch over here, which allows us to switch between frequency shifting HQ, frequency shifting, and ring modulation mode. The first two are pretty much the same thing. However, the frequency shifter HQ just allows for a higher quality frequency shifting, which reduces a lot of that aliasing artifact which shows up in the second option.
Range control. So this section is to control the range or the maximum value of the frequency knob. And there are three options to choose from. The first two are pretty straightforward. The 20 kHz allows you to go 20 kHz up or 20 kHz down from your original sound's frequency. And the 200 Hz allows you for a maximum range of about 200 Hz, both up and down. The tempo mode is a little different, and I need to explain some other controls before I get to that one. So stick around for that, because we are going to cover that later in the video. Moving on to ring modulation. What is ring modulation? So in order to understand ring modulation, we first need to look at amplitude modulation. In amplitude modulation, we have a high frequency waveform called as the carrier wave, which is then modulated with a modulator wave, just typically a low frequency waveform, such that the resultant or the output waveform of this process looks something like this. Here the amplitude of the resultant waveform is a signal, which is essentially the carrier waveform, but its amplitude is modulated in proportion to that of the modulator signal. Ring modulation is similar to amplitude modulation. There is a carrier and a modulator wave, and the resultant is similar to that of amplitude modulation. Although unlike amplitude modulation, we just multiply the two signals directly without an offset, which results in a waveform where whenever the modulator goes below the time axis or its amplitude becomes negative, then that part of the waveform is flipped vertically, meaning positive values of the output become negative and vice versa, and we get a waveform which looks something like this. Now, back in the early days, these techniques were mostly used in electronic communication protocols to send signals through modulation and demodulation. But over the years, the modulation part has also been extensively used in sound design. By the way, if any part of this seems a little overwhelming, then don't worry, because it is a complex topic and I will be covering this in a future video. But as far as this video is concerned, all you need to know is that the resultant depends on the carrier as well as the modulator wave. So here, when we set something like 1 Hz and then play a carrier signal, which is our synth, then the output looks like this. And this is because the modulator signal of frequency shifter is a sine wave by default. So does this mean we cannot use any other waveforms as modulators? No, in fact, we can use any waveform for the modulator that we would like to use, and that can be done with the sidechain section over here. So let me explain. Sidechain. Alright, so I have created a new pattern here, and I have two synths, and one of them would be our carrier and the other would be the modulator. Pass them both through the mixer. And now just pass the modulator signal through the carrier and remove it from the master like so. Now let's put an instance of frequency shifter in the carrier signal's mixer channel. Change the type to ring modulation and then right click and select the modulator signal over here. Now just go to the synth that was generating the modulator wave and change the shape over here. This works with any synth that can generate an oscillation, and I'm just using Citrus because I can set the exact frequency over here with this setting.
Note that when we use sidechain feature, we cannot use the frequency knob, as in that case the frequency control has to be done with the modulator synth. Feedback knob. This knob is a type of feedback loop which takes the signal from the output and then internally routes it back to the input of the plugin. So it's very easy to create phasey Reese-based sounds with this. Let me show you a small demonstration here. Put a frequency shifter and apply a low frequency shift like so. The constructive and destructive phase interactions are what create this phasey sound. Also, unlike the traditional Reese sound where the speed of the phase interaction changes with the pitch of the synth, the frequency shifter retains the rate of modulations at all keys alike. You can also create some really cool quote-unquote FM sounds with this. Take a sine wave around the low mids. I'm taking a 200Hz sine wave with Citrus, but you can use any synth which can do this. Now just put a frequency shifter into the mixer and add a distortion unit like this one. I've used the native Destructor plugin over here as it has harmless lock distortion, although feel free to experiment and use any distortion units for this step. Add a high pass filter like this one to clean up the low end. Now just set the frequency knob to a low value like this and slowly increase the feedback knob until you like what you hear. Alright, so moving on to the sideband section. This section is particularly interesting as it changes the direction in which the frequency shifting is occurring. By default it is set to plus 100, so that means positive values of frequency knob would give you an addition in frequency. And if you turn it the other way around, you get an opposite response, which means that for positive values of frequency, you would get a negative frequency offset. Let's take a look at another demonstration to learn more about sidebands. Let's take a pure tone again of a sine wave at 200Hz and then play the note. You would notice that the position of the sideband changes how the offset is happening. And when the values of the sideband knobs are set to 0, it is as good as just being in ring modulation mode, as you can see here. You initially get an oscillation due to the constructive and destructive interference due to the phase interaction, and then they split up into two. And these are not just any two random frequencies, these are mod of F knob minus F original and mod of F knob plus F original. So in this case, if we take a 50Hz offset, we would end up with mod of 50 plus 200, that is 250Hz, and mod of 50 minus 200, which would give us 150Hz, which we can confirm if we look in the spectrum analyzer over here. By default, these two left and right channels are linked, which means that they move together in similar ratios when linked. Although you can unlink them with this button and move them apart and get some really interesting subliminal based oscillations like these, which can be fun. If you look at the dB meter, you would see that the volume on both channels is the same even though we hear this oscillating sound. This is especially more apparent if you wear headphones and try listening to one channel at a time or move your ear close to one speaker. You might notice that you can only hear one pure sine tone when you listen to one channel, but an oscillating sound when you hear both of them together. And this is exactly why they are called subliminal, as your brain literally adds these two phase shifted sine tones and creates the oscillations in your own head.
But Convolva, hold on for a sec. What are these oscillations in the scope?
Now that's a good question, isn't it? That's because the scope is displaying the mono signal, which is essentially the mathematical addition of both left and right signals, which is incidentally the same thing that your brain does when it hears both the right and left sides. And I can confirm that by showing one of the channels here in the oscilloscope. The scope is currently showing LR addition of both left and right channels, so let's see what it shows when I display only one channel at a time. We see a pure sine tone in each case. And if we zoom in, we can now see the phase shift here. So let's bring it back down here. Okay, moving on to the mix knob. In my opinion, the mix knob is the heart of this plugin, as a lot of phasey sounds that you hear with this plugin are a direct result of the phase cancellation and interactions, as you can see here. So let's take a sine wave in Citrus and then pass it through a frequency shifter. You can see the resultant waveform here in the scope. Now, as I decrease the mix knob, you would be able to notice that the waveform goes up and down in amplitude or volume, and the rate can be controlled by this frequency knob. This is occurring due to the summation or addition of the original dry signal of the sine wave with the frequency shifted wet signal. And the constructive and destructive additions create the ripple-like shapes which make the volume go up and down. Now, I know this can be a complicated topic, so I have made a post on this on my Instagram discussing phase and interference, which you can check out if you are interested. Now, as I increase the amount of frequency shift with the frequency knob, the rate of these ripples increase until it is so fast that we can't hear and tell apart each individual ripples, as we are now modulating at frequencies at audio rate. You also get the splitting of frequencies similar to what we saw when we were discussing the sideband section. Now let's see another example for the same. Note that this knob is not the same as the dry-wet knob that is there over here in the wrapper settings. It's more of a advanced mix control than the one that is there in the channel settings. So moving back to the tempo section here. Now that we have discussed about the mix knob, let's come back to the tempo section once more. Alright, at first glance one might think that this knob does absolutely nothing, but that is far from the case, as it becomes immediately apparent what it is doing as soon as you reduce the mix just by a little bit. Turn on the metronome and now change the frequency knob. The ratios that you see here when you move the frequency knob are tempo synced, which means that the phase interactions that you hear are all synced to the BPM of the track. This is really nice if you're working with something which is polyrhythmic, and you can add just a little bit of feedback to get some really interesting sounds as well. I found the tempo mode to be quite useful for creating tempo synced squelchy sidetrans SFX sounds like these. Now by default, the phase interaction is happening with a sine wave, but we'll talk more about that when we discuss the start phase. Okay, moving on to the start phase. You can see the start phase knob is only available in the tempo mode, and there is a reason for that. Since your phasey oscillations are now tempo dependent, FL knows when each cycle begins and ends, and thus can now shift the starting position with this knob, as you can see here in this demonstration. For this, let's take a pure sine wave in Citrus for demonstration, which you can see here in the scope. Now let's reduce the mix knob to around 50% to get some constructive and destructive interference between the original and the frequency shifted signal like before. And now, whenever I move the start phase knob, you can see in the scope that the resultant waveform shifts in time. So if I increase it towards the right by a little and play again, then you would notice that the waveform moves towards the left. And if I do some more, then it would move some more towards the left. And vice versa if I move towards the other direction. So that's what the start phase does. It moves the waveform towards the left or right depending on its position. Alright, LR phase. This controls the phase difference between the left and right channel oscillations. The idea is to create some difference between the left and right channels by phase shifting so that we get some good stereo information in the sound through this plugin. So let me demonstrate. If we continue with our previous example of phasey oscillations with a sine wave and look at the dB meter over here, we would notice that the volume in both left and right channel outputs move together consistently. Although as I add the LR phase, you can see that they start to move differently and out of phase. At 100%, we get the most phase separation between the channels. This can be really nice in creating some wide stereo effects as we are altering the information through phasing. Although I would be careful as sometimes we add this and if the sounds are too different, they can often result in destructive interference when summed up to be in mono. Moving on to the stereo width. Since this plugin generates so much stereo information, there has to be a way to control that, and for that we have the stereo knob, which is just for that purpose.
Alright, you made it till here. Let's discuss some fun examples now. If you watched the trippy vocals video that I made last year, you would know that frequency shifters can be used with vocals to create risers. So let's take a look into that. Alright guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.